The Prime Minister says some big calls will have to be made as we rebuild from Cyclone Gabrielle. And the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, is with us live this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Prime Minister, what big calls are you talking about?
Well, clearly this is going to have a significant implication for the government's overall thinking in terms of where we're applying our resources and where we're applying taxpayer funding. So road rebuilding is going to become a very big priority, and not just rebuilding but also rethinking perhaps where some of those roads are located, and that's going to require a significant amount of prioritisation. Clearly we need to make sure that we're providing support to those communities that have been devastated by this, and the impact is very variable even in the areas where there has been a significant impact. So we're going to have to work through a process of making sure that we're getting that support to where it is most needed.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big area of focus for us.
Totally. I want to be clear so that people are clear at home what you mean when you say we will rebuild and we will make tough calls. Is every kilometre of road that has been destroyed going to be rebuilt?
Well, in some cases, temporary transport solutions will be put in place to make sure people can still get where they need to get to and goods can still move around. That doesn't mean that every road is going to be restored exactly where it was. We know that we've got roads across the country that have been rebuilt multiple times in recent years, and no sooner has the ribbon been cut on the road reopening as it gets washed out again. We're going to have to think about that. We're going to have to think about whether there are more resilient pathways for some of those roads.
Right.
And we're going to have to do that with a degree of urgency, because we can't leave these communities cut off. So yes, they might have interim measures put in place, and that'll include Bailey bridges, it'll include, you know, roads bulldozed through on a temporary basis. But we then have to look at the overall resilience of some of those roads and whether whether some of them need to be relocated to provide those lifelines that we know those communities rely on.
Okay, but so you're saying the roads will either be rebuilt in the places that they were originally, or they will be rebuilt somewhere else, but there will be a road. State Highway 25A, for example, will be rebuilt in some form or another.
Well, look, what I can say to the Coromandel is that we know that access is an issue for the Coromandel, and we'll work at the best way of making sure that they can continue to get access. I can't guarantee that every individual road. 25A is really problematic.
Yeah.
It has been rebuilt multiple times, and it's only ever been open for a few months at a time before it gets washed out again. So we've actually got to think about
not rebuilding that road at all. Rebuilding that road at all is on the table. That is an option.
Well, I think that's a silly question. We're going to make sure that people in the Coromandel get access and they have a strong roading network. That doesn't mean that every road's going to be rebuilt where it was.
Okay. So what are the options for that stretch of road then?
Well, look, I'm not going to make them up on the spot. We'll work through a process to make sure that we're providing access to the Coromandel and that we're building a resilient roading network there, because clearly the roading network they've got at the moment isn't as resilient as it needs to be.
Phil Twyford says that in Te Atatu, a lot of properties have been affected by flooding, and multiple times, much like the roads. He's talking about voluntary buyouts so that families can actually just say goodbye to the land. Is that something you would consider?
Look, Phil's advocating for his local community, as a good local member of Parliament does. We've got to make sure that where the government is buying out properties, and this is what happened after the Canterbury earthquake, that we've got a good rationale for doing that. That doesn't mean that everybody who's been affected, who decides that they don't want to live where they have been living previously, will have their property purchased. In cases where the land can be remediated, where extra flood protection can be put in place, then it may be that we aren't willing to provide additional buyout options there. On the other hand, in some areas where it's clear that resettlement isn't the best option, as after the Christchurch earthquake, we'll have to work through the best way of addressing that. And again, after the Canterbury earthquakes, the response there was quite different in different areas. So in some cases there was effectively compulsory buyouts, in other cases there was a degree of opt-in, and then in other cases the government said no, we're not going to buy those properties. So we just have to work through a process on that, and we've got to do that based on good geotechnical information, good flood protection information.
Totally.
And we've got to work through a proper process on it.
So compulsory acquisition of some homes is an option?
Well, at this point, we're only a week into dealing with this. You don't take options off the table at this point, but we'll work through a proper process to make sure that the decisions that we're making are good. And of course, we will do that with compassion and respect for those whose lives have been turned upside down.
Totally. Can we talk about a government purchase of land and what might happen with it? This is Megan Wood's, the purchase of land in Rotorua for 350 homes. Originally, this plan was rejected because of fears about flooding, and then that decision was kind of reversed, and they went ahead with the purchase of the land. Is that your intention that will still be used for housing, or are you revisiting those types of decisions now?
So I've had a bit of information on that particular piece of land, and the advice that's been received is that the flood protection mitigations there that can be put in place, not all parts of that land will be able to be developed for housing, but they can still develop up to, I think, 350 houses on it and build them in a way that they will withstand a 1 in 500 year flooding event. What we've got to do is be careful that we're not building in those areas that won't withstand significant flooding. That doesn't mean that whole pockets of land are off the table, but it means that we have to think carefully about how we use them so that flood mitigation is built into the planning.
So will land purchases like this be revisited? Are you putting any current purchases on hold, or are you changing the criteria of future purchases to make sure that, given what we've seen in the last couple of months, that type of thing wouldn't be repeated?
Well, in the case of that particular piece of land, they didn't purchase it until they were absolutely confident that the houses could be built without the risks of significant flooding, and that the flood mitigation that could be put in place there was going to be robust and was going to mean that in a 1 in 500 year flooding event, bearing in mind that we're talking about a 1 in 100 year flooding event at the moment, that a 1 in 500 year flooding event wouldn't disrupt those homes. So I think that they have done that appropriately. They've run a very thorough process there.
Okay, and what's happened in the last couple of months isn't going to change any of that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, we keep talking about a 1 in 100 year, 1 in 250 year, and then we've had all of this flooding. That's not going to change going forward how you might assess land.
Oh, I can't say that land that was purchased 10, 20, 30 years ago might not need to be revisited, but the land that we have purchased in recent times has very much been purchased with this analysis right at the forefront of those decisions. So we haven't purchased land where we don't have a plan for how we could use that safely without this significant risk.
The communication issues, when I was in Hawke's Bay last week, it was the comms that everyone was talking about. How is it that we didn't have communication between rural areas, even in Napier, for example? Do we need more Starlinks? Are we going to go out and buy a bunch of Starlinks to make sure that we have more people connected should this type of thing happen again?
Well, I think on the overall resilience of the network, we have to acknowledge just the extraordinary nature of this event. So if you think about Gisborne, for example, they have 2 fibre connections in and out of Gisborne, one coming from the north, one coming from the south, and they both got wiped out. That's relatively unusual. Normally, if one link was disrupted, you'd be able to fall back onto the other. In the case of cell towers, for example, they were able to get some of those cell towers up and running with generators, but unless there's a fibre connection, then actually data use will be limited and so on. So they will only able to use them for calls and text messages. It has been an extraordinary event. In terms of those issues around contingency, Starlinks have been incredibly useful. It did take a day, some days to get them into all of the areas where we needed to get some temporary, communications restored. So I think we have to look at whether there could be more contingency on standby so that it can be shipped out more quickly in these types of events in the future. I think that's absolutely a legitimate question.
Yeah, all right. Sounds like something we'll get on to. Can we talk truancy for a second? An announcement today, more than $70 million, I think it was, for truancy officers. We had your Education Minister, Jan Tinetti, on the program this morning, and she said she didn't actually know how many truancy officers we currently have. Is that a problem?
Well, it's not the nature of the current contracts. So we currently contract about 77 different providers. Who they employ is up to those providers. So the providers will be allocated kids who are chronically truant, and they have to work with them to get them re-enrolled. They'll employ a mix of different types of people. They might be employing counsellors, they might be employing social workers, they might be employing truancy officers. We don't collect that data. What we collect is the results. So we basically give them an allocation of children and families that they have to work with, and we monitor the results that they achieve with them. What schools have told us is that those on-the-ground truancy officers, which were done away with in about 2010, are actually the most useful thing that they think they need at the moment. And that's why we're restoring those. We're putting funding back into getting more of those truancy officers directly working with schools, connecting schools and families together.
Okay, so the advice or the reason you're going ahead with this funding is because schools have specifically asked for that?
Yes, that's what schools have indicated would be the most useful in getting kids back to school.
All right. Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's great to have you on the show, as always, Prime Minister Chris Hipkins at 2 minutes away from 8 o'clock this morning.